The Intergalactic Institute of Xenobiology had built its reputation on three fundamental principles: rigorous scientific methodology, unbiased cultural analysis, and the unwavering belief that every species could be neatly categorized into boxes of evolutionary superiority. Today's lecture promised to be particularly enlightening, or so the promotional materials claimed, with their characteristic blend of academic pomposity and thinly veiled xenophobia. Professor Vithkan adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes, a flowing ensemble of deep purple that made him look like a cross between a distinguished scholar and an overgrown grape, as he surveyed the packed auditorium. The turnout was impressive, even by his standard. Representatives from 47 different species had gathered to witness what the Institute's marketing department had breathlessly advertised as the definitive, academic dismantling of humanity's evolutionary trajectory. The hegemony's most celebrated expert on primitive species analysis had spent the better part of 3 decades cataloging the failures of lesser civilizations. His methodology was flawless, his conclusions inevitable, and his capacity for self-awareness apparently surgically removed at birth. Today's subject matter held particular appeal for his audience. After all, humans had become something of a cosmic curiosity in recent years, like a particularly fascinating train wreck that everyone felt compelled to analyze from a safe distance. The auditorium itself was a marvel of architectural pretension, with crystalline walls that shifted color based on the emotional resonance of the occupants, and seating arrangements that automatically adjusted to accommodate everything from the gelatinous blob form of the Visceri to the 12-foot wingspan of the Aryan delegate. Currently, the walls displayed a smug shade of amber gold, which roughly translated to intellectual superiority with undertones of barely contained condescension. In the front rows, a cluster of vegan diplomats whispered among themselves in their musical language, their gossamer wings fluttering with anticipation. Behind them, 3 Andromedian scholars sat with the kind of rigid posture that suggested they'd already reached their conclusions and were merely here for the entertainment value. The middle section buzzed with a mixture of species, from the insectoid hive minds of Kepler Prime to the ethereal energy beings from the Nebula Confederacy, all united in their shared anticipation of academic blood sport. Professor Vithkan cleared his throat, a sound that somehow managed to convey both authority and mild irritation at having to share the same oxygen as his intellectual inferiors. His species, the Nixari, had evolved beyond such primitive needs as emotional expression centuries ago, which made them ideal candidates for objective scientific analysis. Or so they told themselves at dinner party. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the kind of measured cadence that suggested every word had been carefully weighed and found superior to ordinary conversation. "Today we embark upon an examination of one of the galaxy's most perplexing evolutionary anomalies, a species so fundamentally flawed in its emotional architecture that one wonders how it managed to achieve spaceflight without accidentally pressing the self-destruct button." A ripple of appreciative chuckling swept through the audience. The Nixari professor allowed himself the ghost of a smile, an expression that on his elongated features looked like someone had tried to fold origami with a rubber band. "The human species," he continued, manipulating his holographic controls with the kind of theatrical flair reserved for particularly dramatic opera performances, represents a fascinating case study in evolutionary dead end. Despite possessing adequate cognitive capabilities and surprisingly robust physical attributes, they have consistently demonstrated a catastrophic inability to overcome their emotional programming. The massive display screen behind him flickered to life, showing the familiar blue-green marble of Earth, rotating slowly against the star-speckled backdrop of space. Several audience members leaned forward with interest. Humans might be primitives, but they did produce entertaining specimens for academic dissection. Today's presentation will explore the theme emotional instability as an evolutionary dead end, the human case study, Vithkan announced with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for announcing the discovery of a new particle or the successful completion of a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. "We shall examine conclusive evidence that demonstrates how emotional decision-making has consistently undermined human potential across multiple scenarios." A Centaurian delegate in the 3rd row raised one of her 4 arms. "Professor, will we be examining specific case study?" "Indeed," Vithkan replied, his tone suggesting he'd been hoping someone would ask that exact question. We have compiled extensive documentation of human behavior across various crisis scenarios. The patterns are remarkably consistent when faced with logical solutions to complex problems. Humans invariably choose the path that prioritizes emotional considerations over practical outcomes. The audience murmured approvingly. This was exactly what they'd come to hear, scientific validation of what they'd always suspected about their primitive neighbors. For example, the professor continued, warming to his subject like a critic reviewing a particularly awful theatrical production. Humans consistently risk their own lives to save individuals who contribute less to their society's overall survival probability. They form emotional attachments that cloud their judgment in resource allocation decisions. Most remarkably, they often sacrifice immediate practical benefits in favor of abstract concepts like honor or justice. An Andromedan scholar's mechanical translation device crackled to life. Fascinating. Are we to understand that they prioritize individual preservation over species optimization? Precisely, Vithcon beamed, or at least performed the Nixari equivalent of beaming, which looked rather like someone trying to smile while experiencing mild indigestion. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary priorities. Any rational species would have corrected these tendencies through selective breeding programs or genetic modification centuries ago. The walls of the auditorium shifted to a deeper gold, reflecting the collective satisfaction of an audience hearing exactly what it wanted to hear. Here was academic confirmation of their superiority, delivered with the kind of scholarly authority that made prejudice feel like enlightenment. Professor Vithcon surveyed his audience with the quiet pride of a chef who'd just served the perfect meal to a table of food critics. Today's lecture would undoubtedly become another jewel in his already impressive crown of academic achievement. After all, dismantling human pretensions to galactic relevance was hardly difficult work. The evidence practically assembled itself. Now then, he announced, calling up his first holographic display, let us begin with a comprehensive analysis of documented human failures in crisis management. The die was cast, the audience was primed, and the professor was about to discover that sometimes the universe has a particularly twisted sense of humor when it comes to the timing of uncomfortable revelation. The first holographic display materialized with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested Professor Vithcon had spent considerable time perfecting his presentation's visual effect. The image showed a human settlement during what appeared to be some sort of natural disaster, buildings crumbling, infrastructure failing, and tiny human figures scurrying about like confused insects. Observe, the professor announced with the satisfaction of a magician revealing his favorite trick. Human response to Category 5 seismic activity on the colony world of New Geneva. Logical protocol would dictate immediate evacuation to designated safety zones, followed by systematic resource preservation and orderly relocation procedures. The hologram zoomed in on a group of humans who were, rather inexplicably, running toward the collapsing structures instead of away from them. Several audience members clicked, buzzed, or performed whatever equivalent of head-shaking their species had evolved. Instead, Vithcon continued, his tone dripping with academic disdain, we observe humans repeatedly returning to unstable structures to retrieve individuals who had already been categorized as statistical losses. Note the inefficient allocation of rescue resources. They prioritize elderly, injured and otherwise economically non-productive citizens over younger, more viable specimens. A Viscari delegate wobbled disapprovingly, their translucent forms shifting through several shades of orange that roughly corresponded to philosophical bewilderment, mixed with species superiority. Through their translation matrix they burbled, do they not comprehend basic triage mathematics? Apparently not, Vithcon replied, calling up statistical projections that hung in the air like accusations. Human rescue operations show a consistent 73% inefficiency rating when compared to optimal survival algorithms. They waste valuable time and resources on what they call heroic gestures, a term that appears to translate roughly as deliberately stupid behavior performed for emotional gratification. The next display showed humans in what appeared to be a military engagement, though calling it military might have been generous, instead of the logical formation-based warfare employed by every other spacefaring species. The humans seemed to be engaging in individual acts of tactical insanity. Combat analysis reveals similar patterns of emotional decision-making. The professor explained, highlighting several instances where human soldiers abandoned strategic position. Here we see a human warrior leaving defensive cover to assist a fallen comrade, despite the mathematical certainty that such action would result in additional casualties. The behavior is repeated across multiple theaters of operation. An Andromedian's mechanical voice crackled through the translation system. Perhaps they lack adequate computational capacity for battlefield analysis. One might assume so, Withkan agreed, but intelligence testing suggests otherwise. They appear to possess sufficient cognitive ability to understand the logical implications of their choices. They simply choose to ignore them in favor of what they term doing the right thing. Another untranslatable concept that seems to prioritize abstract moral constructs over practical outcomes. The audience exchanged glances that conveyed various species equivalents of knowing nod. Here was scientific confirmation of what they'd always suspected. Humans were fundamentally broken at the decision-making level. The holographic display shifted to show human diplomatic negotiations, and even the most charitable observer would have to admit they looked chaotic. While other species conducted orderly discussions based on mathematical resource optimization, humans seemed to spend most of their time arguing about principles, rights, and other intangible concepts. Diplomatic analysis reveals perhaps the most puzzling aspect of human psychology. Withkan announced, warming to his subject like a wine enthusiast describing a particularly awful vintage. They consistently negotiate against their own interests when they perceive their counterparts to be operating from positions of desperation or weakness. A series of trade agreement analyses appeared, showing instance after instance where humans had accepted less favorable terms after learning about their trading partners' economic difficulties. Several audience members made sounds that could only be described as electronic sighs of exasperation. In this case study from the Proxima Trade Accords, the professor continued, pointing to a particularly glaring example. Human negotiators actually reduced their own territorial claims after discovering that their counterparts were facing resource shortages. The behavior is not only economically irrational but demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of competitive evolutionary dynamics. The Centaurian delegate who had spoken earlier raised multiple arms in what appeared to be confusion. Do they not understand that weakness in competitors represents opportunity for advancement? Apparently they view it as an opportunity for what they call compassionate assistance. Withkan replied, his tone suggesting he was discussing a particularly virulent mental disease. They seem to believe that helping competitors overcome disadvantages will somehow benefit their own species in the long term, a notion that flies in the face of every established principle of evolutionary biology. The presentation continued with example after example of human irrationality. They showed footage of humans sharing limited supplies with refugees from hostile species. Mathematical models demonstrated how human resource allocation consistently favored emotional considerations over logical optimization. Economic analyses proved that human trade policies prioritized something called fairness over profit maximization. Perhaps most remarkably, Withkan announced as he called up what appeared to be his coup de grace, humans demonstrate this emotional instability, even when facing extinction-level threats. During the Kepler crisis, when logical analysis indicated that planetary evacuation was the only viable survival strategy, humans spent crucial time and resources attempting to preserve what they called cultural artifacts, objects with no practical survival value whatsoever. The hologram showed humans carefully loading ancient books, artworks, and musical instruments onto evacuation ships while leaving behind far more useful equipment and supplies. The audience's reaction was a symphony of alien incredulity. An Aryan delegate spread their wings in what might have been the equivalent of throwing up their hands. Do they not comprehend that dead cultures cannot appreciate preserved artifacts? One would think so, Withkan agreed. But they seem to believe that survival without cultural continuity is somehow equivalent to extinction. They speak of preserving the essence of humanity as though intangible concepts possessed material value. By this point, the auditorium walls had shifted to a deep, satisfied gold that practically purred with collective intellectual superiority. The audience was getting exactly what they'd paid for, a thorough scientific demolition of human pretensions, backed by rigorous data analysis and delivered with the kind of academic authority that made prejudice feel like enlightenment. Professor Withkan allowed himself a moment to savor his triumph.
Years of research had culminated in this comprehensive catalog of human failure, and the response from his distinguished colleagues was everything he could have hoped for. The evidence was overwhelming, the conclusions inevitable, and his reputation as the galaxy's foremost expert on primitive species was about to receive another significant boost. Now then, he announced, his confidence approaching levels that would have been visible from orbit. Let us examine some specific case studies that demonstrate these patterns in their most extreme manifestation. The professor's fingers moved toward his holographic controls with the kind of casual certainty that suggested he had no idea he was about to accidentally detonate his own career.
Professor Vithkan's next selection from his meticulously organized database of human inadequacy appeared with the same theatrical flourish that had characterized his entire presentation. The holographic display materialized into the image of a single human female, captured in what appeared to be a moment of quiet determination. She stood against a backdrop of stars, her expression neither particularly heroic nor remarkable, just the sort of unremarkable human face that would normally elicit polite academic disinterest. Here we have an exemplary case study, Vithkan began, his tone carrying the satisfied weight of someone about to deliver a particularly devastating blow to human credibility. This individual represents the pinnacle of human emotional instability manifesting in crisis decision-making scenarios. Her actions during the professor paused, noticing that his audience had gone remarkably quiet. The constant background murmur of academic commentary, the soft chittering of translated conversations, even the gentle hum of the Viscari delegates' respiratory processes, all of it had simply stopped. The auditorium walls had shifted from their confident gold to a peculiar shade of uncertain gray-green. In the third row, a vegan diplomat's wings had frozen mid-flutter, creating the kind of stillness that suggested either deep meditation or profound shock. The mechanical translation device of an Andromedian scholar emitted a soft clicking sound that indicated processing confusion, the equivalent of artificial intelligence experiencing something like a double take. Professor, came a voice from the back of the auditorium, carrying the kind of careful neutrality that diplomatic training instilled in those who had learned when to step very, very carefully. The speaker was Ambassador Thexfederi of the Centaurian Trade Federation, and her normally composed four-armed posture had acquired a subtle rigidity that suggested internal alarm systems were beginning to activate. Vithkan replied, his confidence beginning to develop hairline cracks as he noticed more audience members shifting uncomfortably in their species-appropriate seating arrangements. That particular human, Ambassador Thexfederi continued with the kind of measured precision usually reserved for diffusing diplomatic incidents. Could you perhaps verify her identity before proceeding with your analysis? The professor blinked, an expression that on Nexeri features looked rather like someone trying to solve a mathematical equation that had suddenly sprouted extra variables. Identity verification seems unnecessary for this presentation. She serves merely as a representative example of no, interrupted Dr. Yathalan of the Andromedian Scientific Collective, their mechanical voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor that suggested even artificial intelligence could experience something resembling anxiety. I believe the ambassador's request has considerable merit. More voices began rising from the audience, a growing chorus of suddenly very interested academics who seemed to have developed an urgent need for additional information. The casual intellectual bloodsport atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by something that felt distinctly like the moment when a comfortable gathering realizes it has accidentally stumbled into a minefield. In the front row, Elder Vithala of the Viscari Contemplative Order, a being whose species had evolved beyond most forms of emotional expression, was nevertheless managing to project what could only be described as deeply uncomfortable recognition. Their translucent form had shifted through several shades of orange and was now settling into a worried yellow, that roughly translated as, "Oh, dear, this is going to be awkward." Perhaps, Elder Vithala offered with the kind of diplomatic delicacy that species used when they needed to inform someone that they had accidentally declared war on their own allies. You could share with us the specific context of this individual's actions, for academic completeness, of course. Professor Vithkan looked around his auditorium with the dawning awareness that his perfectly orchestrated presentation had somehow transformed into something else entirely. The walls had continued their chromatic shift toward increasingly uncomfortable shades of uncertainty, and the collective body language of his distinguished audience suggested that he had unwittingly wandered into conversational territory that required significantly more careful navigation than he had prepared for. "The context is straightforward," he replied, though his tone had lost some of its earlier pontifical certainty. "This human female made a series of tactically illogical decisions during a crisis scenario that resulted in..." "Which crisis scenario?" The question came from Fleet Commander Zexfek of the Hegemony Defense Corps, whose attendance at academic lectures was unusual enough to be noteworthy, but whose sudden interest in procedural details was positively alarming. The professor consulted his notes with the kind of mechanical precision that beings employed when they suspected they might need to cite sources very carefully in the near future. The incident occurred during the Outer Rim territorial dispute, when human forces encountered superior numbers, and should have executed standard retreat protocols to preserve troop strength for future strategic deployment. The silence that followed this explanation possessed the particular quality of quiet that preceded either profound revelations or spectacular disasters. Several audience members were now looking at each other with expressions that conveyed various species equivalents of "surely he doesn't mean what I think he means." Ambassador Thexfeperi cleared her throat, a sound that managed to convey both diplomatic courtesy and barely suppressed alarm. "Professor, when you say Outer Rim territorial dispute, are you perhaps referring to what some records classify as the Battle of the Helix Nebula?" "The classification is irrelevant to the academic analysis," Vithkan replied, though he was beginning to notice that his audience's attention had shifted from polite interest to something that felt uncomfortably like the moment when students realize their professor has been teaching from the wrong textbook for the entire semester. Ythalolan's mechanical voice crackled with what might have been the artificial intelligence equivalent of diplomatic horror. "Professor, I believe there may be some contextual information that would significantly impact your analysis. This particular engagement was not simply a territorial dispute." The auditorium walls had now shifted to a shade of pale blue that roughly corresponded to collective realization of impending embarrassment, and the professor was beginning to understand that his carefully prepared presentation had somehow become something entirely different from what he had intended. "I fail to see how additional context would alter the fundamental analysis of human emotional decision-making," he replied, though the words carried less conviction than they had moments earlier. Fleet Commander Zexfek leaned forward with the kind of movement that suggested military personnel recognizing a situation that required immediate damage control. "Professor, are you familiar with the strategic outcome of the Battle of the Helix Nebula?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, and Professor Vithkan was beginning to suspect that his next answer might determine whether his academic reputation would survive the remainder of his presentation. "The strategic outcome is irrelevant to the behavioral analysis," Professor Vithkan replied, though his voice now carried the slightly strained quality of someone who suspected they were standing in quicksand, but hadn't quite figured out how deep it went. "The focus of today's presentation is on the decision-making process itself, not the fortuitous results that may have fortuitous." Fleet Commander Zexfek's interruption carried the kind of sharp disbelief that military personnel reserved for moments when civilians demonstrated truly spectacular ignorance of battlefield reality. "Professor, are you suggesting that the salvation of 17 star systems, the prevention of the largest humanitarian crisis in galactic history, and the single-handed termination of the hegemony's most significant existential threat was fortuitous?" The auditorium walls had now achieved a shade of pale yellow that roughly translated to collective academic mortification, and Professor Vithkan found himself experiencing the peculiar sensation of watching his life's work crumble in real time. Ambassador Thexfeperi rose from her seat with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades managing diplomatic disasters, though her expression suggested this particular situation might be testing even her considerable expertise. "Commander, perhaps we should provide Professor Vithkan with the complete contextual framework before proceeding." "The complete contextual framework," Vithkan echoed, his earlier confidence now entirely absent, replaced by the dawning horror of someone who realized they had been giving a presentation about water while standing in the middle of an ocean. Elder Vithkan Sarah's translucent form shifted through several shades of diplomatic orange,
before settling on a color that roughly corresponded to how do we explain this gently. Through their species' complex harmonics they offered. Professor, the individual whose image you have selected as an example of human emotional instability as well. She is the human who prevented the total extinction of the Vithkari people during the dark matter incursion. The silence that followed this revelation possessed the particular quality of quiet that occurred when the universe paused to appreciate a moment of truly exquisite irony. Professor Vithkan stared at the holographic display with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their carefully constructed academic theorem had not only been wrong, but had been wrong in the most spectacularly public way possible. She also, Vithkanen added with mechanical precision, single-handedly prevented the collapse of the Andromedan trade networks when she refused evacuation protocols and chose to remain at Navigation Station Omega-7 during the quantum cascade failure. Her emotionally unstable decision to prioritize the lives of beings she had never met over her own survival probability saved approximately 43 billion lives across 6 sectors. Fleet Commander Zexfak's military bearing had acquired the rigid quality of someone delivering a situation report to a superior officer who really wasn't going to like the news. The tactical analysis you described as illogical was her decision to hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds while civilian evacuation fleets completed their withdrawal from the Helix Nebula. Her emotional instability consisted of choosing certain death over the strategic retreat that would have left 7 million non-combatants trapped in a combat zone. Ambassador Thexfepri's diplomatic training was now working overtime as she attempted to deliver devastating news with appropriate professional courtesy. Professor, the inefficient resource allocation you described involved her personal decision to transfer her ship's entire life support reserves to damaged evacuation vessels, thereby ensuring the survival of approximately 12,000 Centaurian refugees at the cost of her own atmospheric reserve. The holographic image continued to display the unremarkable human face that Professor Vithkan had selected as the perfect example of emotional weakness. She looked back at the assembled aliens with the same quiet determination that had apparently characterized her decision to repeatedly choose everyone else's survival over her own logical self-interest. But she survived, Vithkan managed to say, his voice carrying the desperate quality of someone grasping for any remaining threads of his original argument. Barely, Elder Vithkan replied, their harmonics now carrying undertones of something that could only be described as reverent, and only because 17 different species coordinated the largest rescue operation in galactic history to retrieve someone who had given them everything. The emotionally unstable humans you described spent the equivalent of 3 sector defense budgets to save a single individual who had already saved them. Dr. Yuthkanen's mechanical voice carried what might have been the artificial intelligence equivalent of gentle correction. Professor, your presentation has focused extensively on human tendencies to prioritize emotional considerations over logical outcomes. You appear to have missed the rather significant detail that these illogical emotional considerations consistently result in outcomes that benefit not just humans but every species they encounter. Fleet Commander Zexfak leaned back in his seat with the weary expression of military personnel who had seen enough combat to understand the difference between theoretical strategy and battlefield reality. The humans you describe as tactically incompetent have somehow managed to become the species that every other civilization calls for assistance during existential crises. Their inefficient emotional decision-making has prevented more wars, stopped more genocides, and saved more lives than all our logical strategic planning combined. The walls of the auditorium had now achieved a deep shade of reflective silver that seemed to mirror back each species' growing understanding of exactly how wrong they had been. Professor Vithkan looked around his audience with the dawning realization that his definitive academic demolition of human civilization had somehow transformed into an accidental testament to everything he had been trying to disprove. Ambassador Thexferi offered what might have been the diplomatic equivalent of a gentle pat on the shoulder. Professor, I believe your research methodology may have overlooked a crucial variable in your analysis of human behavior patterns. Which variable? Vithkan asked, though he suspected he really didn't want to know the answer. The possibility, she replied with the kind of careful diplomatic precision reserved for delivering uncomfortable truths, that what you have categorized as emotional instability might actually represent the most sophisticated form of strategic thinking any of us have encountered. After all, the species you describe as evolutionarily doomed has somehow managed to become indispensable to the survival of everyone else in the galaxy. Elder Vithkan's form shifted to a warm golden color that roughly translated to profound philosophical revelation mixed with mild embarrassment. Perhaps, they suggested with the harmonics that indicated deep contemplation, the question is not why humans make emotionally driven decisions that appear illogical, but rather why the rest of us make logically driven decisions that consistently require human intervention to prevent disaster. Professor Vithkan looked back at the holographic display one final time, studying the face of the human who had demolished his life's work simply by being herself. The unremarkable features that he had selected as the perfect example of primitive emotional thinking now seemed to regard him with the quiet patience of someone who had repeatedly chosen to save people who thought she was inferior to them. The irony was exquisite, really. He had spent 3 decades analyzing the failures of human emotional decision-making, only to discover that the galaxy's continued existence depended almost entirely on humans being too emotionally unstable to make the logical choice of letting everyone else solve their own problem. As the auditorium walls shifted to a final shade of deep contemplative blue, Professor Vithkan realized that his presentation had indeed been definitively educational, just not in the way anyone had expected.